In the spring of 2019, in a sale barn outside Bremer County, Iowa, an estate liquidator named Doyle Trask held up a hand-built barn loom and called it firewood with good bones. He meant it kindly. He told the room it would go for $75, maybe less, and that the smart money was on the John Deere 2 rows over. 4 years later, in the autumn of 2023, a single line on a museum acquisition document put a number beside that same loom that made a grown auctioneer sit down on an overturned feed bucket. The span between those 2 afternoons runs through 3 generations of one family, a flock of sheep nobody wanted, and a small burned mark pressed into a beam of cherry wood. Let me tell you about that mark and the woman who knew how to read it. The woman who knew was named Ada Bowl. She was 68 that spring, lean and slow-moving, with hands that had washed and carded and spun raw wool for 50 years, and she was known in that county for 2 things. She was known for never raising her voice, and she was known for being the only person within 100 miles who could still warp a 4-shaft loom from memory. Most people knew the first thing and forgot the second. At her feet most days lay an old border collie named Tip, gray around the muzzle, who had given up herding years ago, and now mostly followed Ada from the barn to the wheel and back, and slept where the loom's shadow fell warm on the floorboards. The loom on the auction block had belonged to her mother, and to her mother's mother before that, and the family had let it go in a probate sale, because the grandchildren who inherited the farmhouse saw a heavy wooden frame taking up half a room, and a buyer offering to haul it away for free. Ada had not been told the sale was happening. She found out the morning from a flyer stapled to the co-op bulletin board, and she drove 40 minutes to stand in the back of a metal building and watch a stranger call her grandmother's life's work scrap. If you have ever watched something that mattered to you get priced by someone who could not see it, stay with me, because this is a story about exactly that gap. If a thing like that happened to you once, leave it in a comment, because half the people watching have a loom of their own somewhere. A thing the world undervalued, and they did not. I will get you. I promise you, it is worth the wait. Doyle Trask was not a bad man. I want that clear before we go further, because the easy version of this story makes him a villain, and the true version does not. He was 55. A licensed estate liquidator with 20 years of barn sales behind him, and he was good at his job, which was moving a dead person's belongings into the trucks of living people for the best price the room would bear. He had handled 1,000 looms, spinning wheels, butter churns, and treadle sewing machines, and he had learned, correctly, that almost none of them were worth more than the wood. He looked at the Bowl loom and saw an old 4-shaft floor loom, the kind a farm wife built or bought a century back, dovetailed and pegged, darkened with age and lanolin. He saw no maker's plate, no brass, no inlay. He saw a thing that would not fit in a modern house. To Doyle, it was clutter with sentimental drag. To Ada, it was something else entirely. She did not bid that morning. She stood at the back with her arms crossed inside her coat, and she listened to the liquidator work the room, and when he got to the loom, she heard him say the word firewood, and she heard the small laugh that went around, and she did not move. The metal building smelled of dust and machine oil, and the coffee somebody had burned on a hot plate near the door. Folding chairs scraped the concrete. A man in a feed store cap leaned to another and said something about how his wife had tried weaving once and the loom had sat in the garage ever since, and the 2 of them grinned. Her granddaughter, who was there, certainly wanted to. Ada had learned a long time ago, though, that you do not win an argument with a man who is paid to be confident, and she had also seen in the half-second when Doyle tipped the loom forward to show its joinery, the thing he had not seen, a small burned mark on the inside face of the breastbeam. A maker's mark. She knew that mark the way you know a face. She kept her arms crossed, and she let the loom sell for $75 to a man who restored furniture for resale, a heavy-set fellow who raised one finger and never raised it again, and she watched two helpers carry the loom out the wide door into the gray morning, its legs sticking up like an overturned animal. Then she went home, and she opened a drawer. Let me tell you about the granddaughter, because she is the one who has to learn what Ada already knew. Her name was Reese, and she was 26, and she had a degree in textile science from a good school, and a job offer from a synthetics manufacturer that paid more than her grandmother had earned in any 10 years of her life. Reese loved Ada. She also thought Ada was stubborn, in the particular way that old rural people are stubborn, holding on to methods that the world had measured and improved upon, and left behind. Reese had spent 4 years learning how fiber behaves under tension, how dye bonds to protein, how to read a tensile graph, and she had come to believe sincerely that what her grandmother did by feel could be done better by instrument. When the loom sold for $75, Reese was angry on Ada's behalf. What she did not yet understand was that the $75 was not the insult. The insult was that no one in the room, including her, could see what the loom actually was. Ada's mother had been a weaver, and her mother before that, and the line ran back to a woman named Marta, who had come from the old country in 1887 with a wooden chest, a breeding pair of long-wool sheep, and a head full of patterns she had never written down. Marta settled the Bremer County ground that the family still farmed, and she built her flock from those two animals, selecting every year not for the most wool or the fastest growth, but for the fiber that took dye, cleanly, and held a twist. Let me tell you about that, because it is the mechanism under everything that follows. A sheep's fleece is not one thing. The length of the staple, the diameter of each fiber, the number of crimps per inch, the way the scales on the surface of the wool lock together, all of it varies animal to animal and is heritable, which means a patient breeder choosing the same trait across many years can build a flock whose wool does something no commodity fleece can do. Marta chose for luster, and for a long, even staple that spun fine without breaking. She wrote nothing down because she did not need to. She carried it in her hands, and she passed it to her daughter at the wheel. The loom came later. Marta's husband built it in 1901 from a cherry tree that had grown on the property, and when he finished it, he burned his initials and the year into the inside of the breastbeam, the way a man signs a thing he expects to outlast him. That was the mark, a small interlocked monogram and a date, hidden where only someone warping the loom would ever put their face close enough to see it. For 118 years, it sat against that beam while 3 generations of women threaded it. And in the spring of 2019, a furniture restorer bought it for $75 and took it to his shop to strip and refinish it for resale, and he had no idea what the mark was either. Which brings us back to Ada and to the drawer she opened when she got home. Inside was her grandmother's pattern book, a cloth-bound ledger filled with drafts in faded pencil, threadings and tie-ups and treadling sequences, each one labeled in a hand that slanted hard to the right. And tucked in the back, on a loose page, was a rubbing. Someone, decades earlier, had laid a sheet of thin paper over the maker's mark on the breastbeam and rubbed a pencil across it, the way a child takes a rubbing off a gravestone, and the interlocked monogram and the date 1901 stood out clear and dark on the page. Ada had made that rubbing herself when she was 9 years old, sitting under the loom while her grandmother wove. She had kept it for 59 years. She set it on the kitchen table next to the auction flyer, and she looked at the two pieces of paper for a long time, and then she picked up the phone and called the man who had bought the loom. He did not want to sell it back. He had paid $75, and he wanted $300 because he had already begun sanding the legs. And Ada heard that and went quiet on the line in a way that frightened him a little, though he could not have said why. She paid the $300. She drove her truck to his shop. Then she and Reese loaded the loom into the bed and tied it down with ratchet straps. And on the way home, Reese said the thing that she would spend the next several years unlearning. She said, "Grandma, it is just a loom. You could buy a brand new 8-shaft for what you are about to put into restoring this one." Ada did not answer right away. She drove. Then she said, "You are right about the price. You are wrong about what it is." And she did not explain, because explaining was not how Ada taught. Let me tell you what a maker's mark does. Because Reese did not understand it yet, and most people. In the world of handwork, an object made by a known hand is not the same object as an identical one made by an unknown hand. And this is not sentiment, it is provenance. And provenance is a thing the market measures very precisely when it can be established. The trouble is that it usually cannot. A barn loom built by a farmer in 1901 is almost always anonymous, and an anonymous antique loom is worth, correctly, about $75. There are tens of thousands of them in barns and garages and online listings, and the market has priced them all the same, which is to say at the value of the wood and the labor of moving it. Marta's husband, though, had not been merely a farmer. His name was Anton, and he had apprenticed 7 years as a joiner in the old country before he ever saw Iowa, learning to cut dovetails by hand and to read the grain of a board the way Ada would later read the grain of this very beam. A small number of the pieces he built in his first decade in the new country. A blanket chest, a corner cupboard, a child's cradle, a trestle table, had found their way over the years through estate sales and a dealer or two, and finally into a regional collection of immigrant craft furniture. Those pieces carry the same interlocked monogram, burned in the same hidden way. An A and a B, locked together, the family initial his American neighbors had shortened from something longer. A museum 200 miles away had 4 of them attributed and catalogued and valued, and had been looking, quietly and for years, for more, because a maker known by only 4 surviving pieces is a maker whose 5th piece matters enormously to the people who study such thing. The loom in Ada's truck was that 5th piece, and it was the only known working loom by that hand, and it was the only one of any kind, still in the possession of the maker's direct descendants, which in the language of provenance is the difference between a strong attribution. None of that was visible to Doyle Trask. All of it was visible to Ada, because she had spent her whole life close enough to the wood to read what was burned into it. The first dismissal, the firewood line, was the one the whole county heard. The second one came at a kitchen table, and it was Reese who delivered it, though she did not know she was dismissing anything. It was that summer, and Ada had set the loom up in the front room and warped it for the first time in years, threading 400 ends through the heddles over 3 patient evenings, and she had asked Reese to help her ply some yarn from the spring clip, the wool off the same flock that ran back to Marta's 2 sheep. They sat at the table with the singles wound on 2 bobbins and the plying wheel between them, and the late light came in low and gold through the west window and lay across the wood. Reese ran the fiber through her fingers and she felt the unevenness in it, the thick and the thin, and she said in the careful voice of someone who has measured things, "This is nice, but it is not consistent. A mill could give you a more uniform yarn." Ada treadled twice and let the twist run up the strand before she answered. "The wool is not supposed to be uniform," she said. Reese said uniformity was the whole point of quality control, that it was the first thing they taught, that a buyer needed to know every batch would behave the same. Ada said quality and uniformity were two different words, and that her grandmother had spent 40 years making sure they stayed different. She said it without heat, the way she said most things, and she went back to the wheel. Reese watched her grandmother's foot keep its rhythm, and she decided privately that the old woman had simply never had access to better tools, had never seen a fibergraph, had never had the vocabulary to know what she was missing. She was sincere. She was also, on that afternoon, completely wrong, in the exact way the world is usually wrong about people like Ada. Now, let me tell you about the neighbor, because his path runs alongside this one and breaks before it ends. His name was Garth, and he ran the largest sheep operation in that part of the county, 1,100 head of a commercial meat breed, and he had done everything the extension service and the lenders and the consultants told him to do. He had borrowed against the flock to buy a new handling system, a powder-coated maze of gates and a hydraulic squeeze chute that could run 200 head an hour through worming and shearing, and a self-propelled feed mixer that cost more than Ada's whole farm had been worth on paper. He had bred for fast growth and high lambing percentage, chasing the numbers the consultants put up on the projector at the winter meetings, and he had contracted his wool clip to a broker at a fixed price per pound that looked in 2019 and 2020. Garth was not a fool. He was 44. He had taken over from his father and tripled the operation, and he was a good operator, following good advice, and for 2 years the advice looked right. His lambs went out heavy and on schedule. His wool went to the broker by the semi-load, and his operation was held up at the county meetings as the model everyone else should study. Ada's 40 ewes, by contrast, were an oddity people drove past. Slow-growing, oddly colored, with that long, lustrous fleece that hung in locks, instead of the dense, uniform staple the commodity market paid for, kept for fiber. Nobody in that market wanted. To the broker, they were worthless. To Ada, they were the only thing she had never been willing to sell. Reese took the synthetics job that fall in a city 4 hours away, and for a while the loom sat warped and half-woven in the front room, while Ada worked it alone in the evenings. Reese came home most weekends, though, and most weekends she found herself sitting under that loom the way her grandmother had sat under it as a child, watching the shuttle go and the pattern build, and somewhere in there a small doubt about her doubt began to form. She had a tensile tester at work, an expensive instrument that measured exactly how much force a fiber could take before it broke. One weekend, she brought home a sample bag and tested a length of her grandmother's hand-spun against a length of the mill yarn. She had praised the hand-spun took more force, not a little more, considerably more. Reese ran it 3 times because she did not believe it, and 3 times the slow, uneven, hand-spun yarn off the unwanted flock outperformed the uniform mill yarn she had been taught was better. She did not tell Ada. She drove back to the city, and she thought about it for a month. Let me tell you about why that happened. Because the instrument only measured it. It did not explain it. And the explanation, A mill spins for uniformity because uniformity is what a machine can guarantee and a buyer can specify on a purchase order. To get it, the mill combs the fiber until every strand lies parallel, a process called combing that pulls out the short fibers and the noils and throws them aside, and then it clips what remains to a standard length so the spinning frame can feed it evenly. In doing so, it cuts the longest fibers down to match the shortest and strips out the natural variation in the staple. The result is even, and it is weaker, and the reason is simple once you see it. The strength of a yarn lives in the long fibers that run far enough along the strand to wrap around and bind the short ones, the way long straws in a bale hold the short chaff together. A mill removes exactly those long fibers in the name of uniformity, because a long fiber and a short fiber side by side are not uniform, and so the machine trims the long one down. Marta had bred her flock for a long, strong, lustrous staple, precisely so that a hand spinner could keep those long fibers whole, drafting them into the yarn at their full length instead of cutting them out. 130 years of selection lived in that wool, in the length and the crimp and the way the surface scales gripped. The tensile tester did not know any of that. It just clamped a length of yarn between two jaws and pulled until it broke, and reported a number, and the number contradicted everything Reese had been taught, and it could not tell her why because the why was not in the yarn. The why was in the sheep, and in the woman who had chosen the sheep, and in the woman before her. That was the first crack. The conversion took longer. The third dismissal came in the winter of 2021, and it came from the broker, and it was the one that landed just before the world turned over. There was a regional fiber meeting, the kind of event where producers and buyers and a few academics sit in a community hall and drink bad coffee, and Ada had been talked into bringing a few skeins of her hand-spun and a small woven sample to a table at the back. The broker, a confident man named Pell, who bought wool by the semi-load, walked the tables and stopped at Ada's and picked up a skein and rubbed it between his fingers and set it down. Botik, he said. It was not an insult in his mouth. It was a category. He meant it could never be more than a hobby, that it would never move volume, that the real money was in the contracted clip going out by the ton. He told Ada, kindly, that there was no market for what she made, that the world ran on uniformity and price, and that she was welcome to keep doing it for love, but should not expect it to ever be worth anything. Reese was standing beside her grandmother when he said it. She had the tensile numbers in her phone. She said nothing, but the doubt about her doubt had become something harder now, and she was beginning to understand which side of the table she actually stood on. Then came the drought, and the broker's market, and the rate notice, and the long bad year that settled the argument that no person in that hall could settle. The summer of 2022 was the driest in Bremer County in 70 years. The pasture burned brown by July. The creek that fed the lower ground went to a string of pools, and then to cracked mud, and feed prices climbed past anything the consultants had modeled. Garth, with 1,100 head bred for growth and an appetite to match, ran out of grass first. He had to buy hay at drought prices to keep the flock alive, trucked in from 2 states away at a figure that doubled and then tripled, and the self-propelled mixer that had been the symbol of his operation now ran every day on diesel that cost more than the lambs it fed were worth at market. His wool clip, contracted at a fixed price, came in at a fraction of what it had cost him to grow it, because the broker's price had been set in a fat year, and the contract did not care that the year had turned lean. The bank cared, though. A rate notice came in August, an adjustment on the note he had signed for the handling system, and the payment climbed in the same season, his income fell through the floor. By the end of that month, he was selling breeding stock at a loss to make the interest payment. By October, he was selling the system itself, watching a flatbed haul off the powder-coated gates he had owned for 3 years, and a man he had never met loaded the hydraulic chute and drove it to a county where the grass had held. Ada's 40 ewes ate less because they had always eaten less, and they held condition on poor pasture because Marta had bred them for a hard country, and the breeding had never been undone. She did not have a contract, so she was not locked into a price that had become a wound. She lost no animals. Through the worst of that summer, Tip kept to the porch shade and walked the fence line with her at dusk. When the heat broke, the old dog moving slow but moving, and the 40 ewes drifted in off the burned pasture each evening, lean but sound. Let me give you the two numbers side by side, because the niche of this story is the contrast, and the contrast is real. Garth lost 340 head that year, sold or dead, nearly a third of his flock, and took on roughly $200,000 of additional debt to keep the rest alive. Ada lost nothing, spent perhaps $4,000 on supplemental hay, and came through the drought with her flock and her ground intact. The county average lamb crop fell by nearly a quarter. Hers held. To the broker, it had been worthless. To the drought, it was the only thing that worked. The drought was not the reveal, though. The drought only cleared the ground for it. Let me tell you what happened next, because this is the part Reese remembers most clearly, the part where the doubt about her doubt finally finished turning. In the spring of 2023, a textile historian from the museum that held the 4 attributed pieces came to Bremer County following a tip from a furniture restorer who had once briefly owned an old loom with a strange burned mark he could not identify and had sold back to an old woman for $300. The historian's name was Hones, and she was the qualified outside judge this story had been waiting for. The person with the standing to say what a thing was worth in a language the market would accept. She came to the farmhouse. Ada set the pattern book and the 59-year-old rubbing on the kitchen table beside the loom, and Hans put on cotton gloves and laid her face close to the breast beam, close enough to read what was burned there, and she was quiet for a long time. She asked one question. She asked whether the loom still worked. Ada said it did. Hans asked her to weave on it, and Ada sat down on the bench worn smooth by 3 generations and threw the shuttle, and the historian watched the only known working loom by that maker do the thing it had been built to do in the hands of the maker's direct descendant, with yarn spun from the flock the maker's wife had bred. The shed opened, the shuttle flew, the beater came back with a soft thud, and the pattern grew a 1/4 inch. Hans did not speak through any of it. Then she stepped out onto the front porch and made a phone call, and Ada and Reese sat in the kitchen and did not look at each other and listened to the low murmur of a voice they could not make out. When Hans came back inside, she set her gloves on the table and she folded her hands and she said, "The museum wished to acquire the loom, the pattern book, and a representative collection of the hand-spun and woven work, as a single cultural holding with Ada retained as a living tradition consultant." She named the figure on the acquisition document, $81,000. She said it once, plainly, the way you set down something heavy, and then no one said anything at all. A clock ticked somewhere in the house. The number sat in the kitchen and seemed to change the size of the room. It was not the largest number anyone in that family had ever heard, but it landed with a force out of all proportion to its size because of where it had come from and what it answered. 4 years earlier, a man had called this loom firewood and let it go for $75 to a heavy-set furniture restorer who raised one finger in a metal building that smelled of burned coffee. Now, A person qualified to know had put 81,000 beside it, and the difference between those two numbers was not inflation and was not luck. It was the difference between what a thing looks like to someone who cannot read it and what it is to someone who can. Reese stood in the doorway with the tensile numbers still in her phone, numbers that now seemed like the smallest possible proof of a thing she finally understood completely, and she put the phone in her pocket and did not take it out again. Outside, a sheep called once across the yard and went quiet. Nobody moved to fill the silence. The old woman sat on the bench with her hands in her lap and looked at the cloth she had just woven, and let the number be what it was. Word of the museum acquisition moved through the county the way news moves in farm country, slowly and then all at once, and it reached Doyle Trask, who had called the Loom firewood with a kindness he had meant sincerely. He drove out to the farmhouse one afternoon that fall uninvited, and he stood in the yard, turning his cap in his hands, while Tip's successor barked once from the porch and then decided he was harmless. He was not a man who apologized easily, because his whole trade rested on the confidence that he could look at a thing and know what it was worth. And a man who admits he missed one is a man inviting every past client to wonder what else he missed. He told Ada he had handled 1,000 looms, and never once seen what he had missed on hers. He asked her how she had known. And here the story could have curdled into the protagonist's triumph, the I told you so, and it did not. That was I told. That was not who Ada was. She did not tell him he should have known. She did not say a word about the laugh that had gone around the room. She took him into the front room and she showed him the mark, and she handed him the rubbing she had made at 9 years old, the paper soft as cloth with age, and she explained plainly what a maker's mark is and how to look for one, where on a piece a joiner of that era would sign his work, on the underside of a drawer bottom, behind a cleat. On the inner face of a beam no buyer ever turns to look at. She told him the signature hides where the work is honest, not where the work is shown. Doyle Trask, 55 years a confident appraiser, sat down on a kitchen chair and got out the small notebook he used for sale inventories and asked an old woman to teach him how to see. He filled 2 pages. The next spring, at a farm sale 3 counties over, he stopped a buyer from hauling off a pie safe for $40, turned it over, found the mark, and the thing brought $1,100. He sent Ada a card about it. She kept it in the drawer with the rubbing. That was the recalibration, and it was gentle, because the structural shock had already done the hard part. The drought had broken Garth, not Ada, and the broker's confident market had been the thing that broke him. Pell, who had called her work boutique, lost most of his contracted suppliers that year as the drought wrecked the commodity clip across 3 counties, and the boutique fiber he had dismissed was the only segment of the wool market that held its price, because the people who bought it for what it was and not for what it weighed. He did not come to the farmhouse and turn his cap in his hands. Men like Pell rarely do. The next year, though, his replacement at the brokerage called Ada to ask carefully whether she might be interested in supplying a specialty line, and Ada said she would think about it, and she thought about it, and she said no. She had seen what a contract did to Garth. She was not going to scale her flock, to fill an order and breed away in 5 years, what Marta had spent a lifetime breeding in. She kept her 40 ewes at 40. Let me tell you about Garth, because the niche owes him compassion and not a sneer, and because what Ada did next is the moral center of this whole account. He did not lose the farm. He came close. He sold the mixer and the handling system, and 1/3 of his flock, And he stood in his own kitchen that winter, doing arithmetic that would not come out right, and Ada heard about it, the way you hear about a neighbor's trouble, and she drove over with a sack of her grandmother's seed wool and a different kind of offer. She did not lecture him. She did not tell him his model had been fragile. She told him she had 40 good ewes whose line had come through the drought without a scratch, and that she was getting too old to keep up the breeding records the way they needed keeping, and she asked whether he would take a dozen of them and learn the selection so the line would have somewhere to stand if her own ground ever went. It was charity dressed as a request for help, and Garth, who was proud, could accept it because it was shaped as a favor to her. He took the dozen ewes. He learned the records. He is breeding that line today alongside what is left of his commercial flock, and the two of them sit on the same ground now, the fast, fragile kind and the slow, durable kind, which is its own small lesson about what a wise operator keeps. And Reese came home. She gave notice at the synthetics manufacturer in the spring of 2024, and she moved back to Bremer County, and she took up the loom and the pattern book and the flock, and she did it with her degree intact, because the degree had never been the problem. The tensile tester had been right about the wool. It had simply been measuring something her grandmother had built, and her professors had never thought to look for. Reese formalized what Marta had carried in her hands, and Ada had carried in a pencil ledger. She wrote the breeding records into a proper database. She cataloged the drafts in the pattern book and began carefully to add her own. She did not replace the old knowledge with the new. She gave the old knowledge a second language to be remembered in. The museum kept Ada on as a consultant and brought Reese in to document the living tradition, and the $75 loom became the centerpiece of a holding that will outlast everyone in this story. Let me tell you what the neighbors did, because the spread of a method is how you know it was real and not just lucky. After the drought, 3 other small operators in the county came to Ada to ask about her flock, and she sold them breeding stock at a fair price, and she taught them the selection, the same way she had taught Garth and was teaching Reese. The fiber that the broker had said had no market found its market. Slowly, among hand spinners and weavers and small mills who paid for the long staple and the luster and the strength, and paid willingly because they could feel in their hands what an instrument had measured and a museum had certified. Ada did not get rich. She would not have used that word, and she would have disliked anyone who used it about her. She paid off the small note on her truck. She put a new roof on the barn. She kept her ewes at 40. The wealth that came to her was the right size for the ground she stood on, and she let it be that size on purpose, because she had watched what happened to a man who let his operation grow past what his land could carry. Here is the thing I came to this story to say, and I will say it plainly, the way the old woman would have hated and the historian would have understood. There are 2 kinds of knowing. There is the kind that measures what is easy to measure, and is confident in proportion to how much it has measured, and it builds tensile testers and contracts and self-propelled mixers, and it is genuinely, usefully smart, and it runs the world most days. And there is the other kind, the narrow, deep, patient kind, that lives in one pair of hands on one piece of ground across a long time, that cannot always say why it knows what it knows, that breeds for a staple it cannot define to a buyer, and burns a mark into a beam where no one will look for 100 years. The first kind measures value. The second kind makes it. Most days, the first kind wins, because most days the weather holds, and the market is fat, and the model fits the world closely enough. And then comes a dry summer, or a qualified eye laid close against a beam of cherry wood. And the difference between the 2 kinds of knowing is suddenly the only thing that matters, and It is always larger than anyone expected. The loom is in a museum now, behind glass, but they bring it out twice a year, and Reese warps it and weaves on it, so the wood does not forget what it is for. The flock is on the home ground and on Garth's ground, both hedged across two farms, the way a wise breeder hedges anything she cannot bear to lose. The pattern book has a second volume now in a younger hand. And on the inside of the breast beam, where a joiner signed a thing he expected to outlast him, the small burned monogram and the date, 1901, are still there, still hidden, still legible to anyone who knows to lay their face against the wood and look. $75 is what it cost, a man who could not see it. What it was worth was never a number. The number only told the rest of us, at last, what one old woman had known since she was 9 years old, sitting under the loom while her grandmother wove, watching the shuttle go, learning to read what was burned into the grain. Tip is gone now, buried under the cherry stump where the tree that became the loom once stood, and a younger dog sleeps in the loom shadow on the front room floor where the light comes in low and gold. Reese throws the shuttle. The wood does not forget what it is for.